Do you remember the birth of PayPal? It is the company that was the training ground of the world's best entrepreneurs who defined our reality as we know it today.
I'm going to paraphrase it, but he basically says PayPal was, if you are at a company that's very successful and it's easy, then you learn the wrong lesson, which is that making internet companies is easy. If you're at a company and it's hard and it fails, then you learn the wrong lesson, which is you can't be successful. He said that what we learned at PayPal is that it was hard and we were successful. So we sort of learned the right lessons, which is it's not easy to do this, but you can actually have a success. There were generations of people who lost everything and sort of believed the internet was never going to come back, right? And many of them, by the way, were like equally as smart, equally as talented. It was just a matter of timing and circumstance.
In this episode, I unlock the untold stories behind PayPal's meteoric rise and the entrepreneurs who made it possible. The writer Jimmy Soni explores the captivating story of PayPal and the entrepreneurs who helped shape Silicon Valley. We are talking about the inspiration for writing this book, dissecting Jimmy's writing process, the origin story of the PayPal Mafia, the role of jazz and the secret code hidden in the book, storytelling lessons for entrepreneurs, and much, much more. From Elon Musk to Peter Thiel and many others whose stories have never been told, hear about the scrappy online payment startup that faced fierce competition and internal strife on its journey to becoming one of the world's foremost companies. Award-winning author Jimmy Soni brings this intensely magnetic chronicle to life with unprecedented access to thousands of pages of internal material and hundreds of interviews. Discover how PayPal's founders, who are now considered the technology industry's most powerful network, drove 21st century innovation and entrepreneurship as they formed, funded, and advised some of the leading companies of our era, including Tesla, Facebook, YouTube, SpaceX, Yelp, Palantir, and LinkedIn. From the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times, this national bestseller has received critical acclaim for its captivating exploration of PayPal's origins and the influential individuals behind its success. I hope you enjoy this episode the same way as I did. Jimmy, it's very, very good to see you after Thanksgiving. How was the celebration yesterday?
It was good. A lot of food, too much food, which is good. It's like the one day a year you're allowed to do that. And then, just time with family and friends. It was nice. It was really nice. It's funny that it's like, I think it's a uniquely American holiday, right? And so you have this situation where like you might not always be in sync with other people who are around the world, but it's nice.
I think the modern social media tools make sure that everybody gets aware of celebrations all over the world. I read on LinkedIn yesterday a lot of Thanksgiving messages and just wondered because I remembered Canada is not on the same day, isn't it? I think Canada is a month earlier or something like that.
Yeah, Canada has a different day. I can't remember which. Yeah.
Yeah, me neither. But let's jump right to the topic before we get into a lengthy conversation about holidays and Thanksgiving, which obviously is pleasurable. Let me first thank you for this book. It's really awesome. It's absolutely fantastic. I had only one severe problem with the book. So let's tackle that first.
Yeah.
You described the story of the founders of PayPal back in the 90s and also in the 90s, I'm now 48 years old. In the 90s, I did research in exactly this area, internet, how the internet will transform business. And back then, it was really difficult to get information, to get access to people. We didn't have the internet in a way we have it now. So what I read about PayPal, about Amazon, about eBay was basically more or less background stories from secondary literature. And I didn't have a chance to talk to people like Elon Musk, Levchin, Thiel, and all the others. And the only problem I had with reading the book, it was walking down memory lane for me. So it really slows down the process, because I said, I read about it. I got to my notes from back then and checked it back. And then I read your notes section, which is really awesome. So unfortunately, I couldn't finish the book. I'm at page 155 because it was really for me a slow reading process.
Right. That's funny. Well, I appreciate the slow read too. Spoiler alert: the company is successful at the end. So it survived. It didn't die like a lot of .coms from that era. So I hate to ruin the ending, but
this is the unfortunate thing with real life, that we know the ending 20 years later and how people evolved after that. The first question I have to you is, how did you get the idea? Where did you get the inspiration from to write this book?
Yeah, it's a great place to start. Because, I'm not a tech journalist. I don't cover these people every day. Right. And I write histories. And so I had written this book called A Mind at Play, which was a biography of Claude Shannon, who was an information theorist. He created the field of information theory. He was an electrical engineer and a mathematician. And he worked at a place called Bell Labs. And Bell Labs in the 20th century, it's this extraordinary collection of people. And we live with the sort of fruits of the output, right? So they invented touch-tone dialing, they invented the laser, they invented satellite communications. They invented most of what is considered modern communication networks. And Shannon was working there with a bunch of other just really talented people. And I started to think about what are other Bell Labs like clusters of talent? There's like this interesting thing of like books are generally written about these like individuals, like lone people who are very accomplished, right? So you do a biography of Steve Jobs, you do a biography of Michael Jordan, right? But to me, the kind of interesting question with these clusters is, why is it that one place can attract all of this talent? Like that just doesn't seem likely. Like the odds are against it, right? And then you sort of start to ask yourself like nature and nurture questions. Like, were they there because they were talented, or did the place make them talented, right? And so I thought about other concentrations of talent. There's a few. One is Xerox PARC. Another is Fairchild Semiconductor. And then you fast forward in the history, and the most recent example, I think, or one of them, is PayPal. And I just didn't find a book that explained the story of how all of these people came to one place at one time. And that seemed very peculiar to me, because we're talking about, Elon Musk and Reid Hoffman and Peter Thiel and Max Levchin. And I just nobody it was like this thing, or it's like, why didn't anybody do this? Like, this just doesn't make any sense, Like all these other big companies, their origin stories have been written. Amazon, Apple, Facebook, etc. And I just, I sort of said to myself, there's an interesting, not the whole story, not like the 22-year history of PayPal, but this early period was for the reasons you described, like the internet was coming into its own. People weren't, we were just taking our first steps into e-commerce. There were overnight internet millionaires from 1995 to 1999. And then you go through the dot-com bubble bursting. And my thesis was basically like, I think this is an interesting group of people at an interesting moment in history. Why hasn't anybody done this? And then I just started, that's where it began, was kind of just asking the question, this is a book I would want to read. Like I would want to try to understand how this happened.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. In the 90s, I think what caught my eye in the book was that principle back then, people had similar ideas in Europe and also in San Francisco. The interesting thing for me was that back in the 90s, I always felt as a European, Europe is winning. We are right on the tech track. 1989 changed a lot in Europe. We were coming closer. A lot of countries joined the European Union. And in the mobile industry, I think Europe was at the first, or at least at the second place. Then after the dot-com bubble burst, nothing happened anymore in Europe. It was over. Yeah. And Silicon Valley just took off. And one thought I had when I read through your book is, do you think that it was these people that basically laid the foundation of the success stories in Silicon Valley 20 years ago?
It's a good question. And I think I'm going to give like a kind of two-part answer. The first part, and this is really important, is, there was Silicon Valley before there was the internet, right? Mm-hmm. And so there was meaning like Apple, when in the era it was made, that was still considered a Silicon Valley company, but it was not an internet company. And I think those two things can often get confused. Like, there's a Silicon Valley pre-Facebook, there's a Silicon Valley pre-Twitter, right? In fact, one of the things about Elon Musk that people don't know is that he was actually involved in even the pre-internet, like the 1995, 1996 era internet. His first company was called Zip2. Even before PayPal, he had a success. And so there's a whole history of Silicon Valley that predates the period I'm writing about. The thing that happened right after the dot-com bubble bursting is that this group of people were part of the generation that had two things going for them. One is that they had actually seen the internet be successful because PayPal didn't fail, right? So what happened is, like, you had all these internet companies that fail in 1999 and 2000. I mean, famous failures, buying Super Bowl ads and like finished 8 months later, right? These people had the experience of, well, building an internet company is brutally hard, but we can actually do it. We can actually make it something amazing, and it can be financially successful, and we can return money to our investors. So that was sort of thing one. The second thing they had is that they had a group of people they knew who they were going to build the next generation of internet companies, and were already starting. I found this email when I was like digging around. Actually, this is a great story. I didn't include this in the book, but this is a great story. So somebody had shared with me like 5 gigabytes of email from that era. And I was like, 5
gigabytes,
yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So this is like, you look, yeah.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but when we go back to emails in the 90s, it was no video, it was no attachments, basically, no big attachments, only text. So you went through 5 gigabytes of text?
Yeah.
Wow.
And there were Word doc attachments, and there were PDFs, and there were Excel spreadsheets. So it's not that there weren't attachments, and there were some images but basically what happened is this person had kept this big file, and it was like the old Outlook files, right? So I had to find a computer program from the 1990s to even like interpret this thing. But I went through all these emails. I mean, a lot of them. This was basically my life for several years. It was just waking up every day and going through hundreds of emails. It was really both fun from the perspective of being somebody who writes history, and also very tedious for anybody who doesn't do this kind of work, right? Like, it's sort of been the most boring process. But one of the things I found is this old email from Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman was writing to somebody and explaining like why he should invest in LinkedIn. Like, this is when LinkedIn is still just like an idea. And he offers these like few bullets about what LinkedIn could be, right? Like, here's what LinkedIn might be. And it was the most extraordinary thing, because you think to yourself, okay, today he's regarded, like he's Reid Hoffman. He is masters of scale. He is, all of the things. And at the time, he was somebody that had seen a successful internet company, had a little bit of money and breathing room, but not like the kind of money that these people do today, but was soliciting investments from the only other people he knew who had those two things: a little bit of capital and the belief that the internet could be successful. And so that's like a big part of this, is that they had their immediate network, their immediate coworkers who they had just worked with at PayPal, believed in the possibilities of the internet and had the money to provide a little bit of seed capital. And so the seed capital for a lot of big companies comes out of the PayPal alumni, but it comes like right away, like 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. So the most famous example of this is Peter Thiel with the first $500,000 of outside money into Facebook. That is a sort of famous story. He talks about how it was an easy investment because the only thing that they needed to buy was more server capacity because the demand for the product was so high. And there's all these stories around it now. It sort of becomes Silicon Valley legend. The important thing for me is kind of that moment is a kind of boring thing, which is Peter Thiel is not a part of the generation of investors who saw all their money go up in flames in 1999 and 2000 and 2001 because they made bets on, whatever. And so they have this hope, they have this sort of belief, and they have a little bit of capital to invest. I think it's a stretch to say that they are the reason that we have the technologies we do today. But it's fair to say that they are a big part of what becomes known as Web 2.0. So out of the ashes of sort of the early internet comes the series of technologies and other things that emerge in Web 2.0. And this group really were at the ground floor of that effort, right? And some of the household brand companies that still exist today, Yelp, LinkedIn, all of the Tesla, they all emerged from this particular group. And so I think that's probably the most accurate answer I can give, which is to say there was a Silicon Valley before the internet, but this group did a lot to supercharge the creation of companies after 2002.
I absolutely believe that. I mean, I'm always surprised that Europe lost it in the crash in 2000 and Silicon Valley didn't. They moved forward, and I believe the driving forces, of course, were the people like Elon Musk who I would say added tremendous value to entrepreneurship in the United States. And for some reason, Europe needed, I think, 1 or 2 decades longer to just recover from the crashes.
I think that's right. I think, I'm not any kind of expert on the reasons for that. But I would say that what I learned in doing my PayPal research, there's a great line that Peter says, he says, PayPal, I'm going to paraphrase it, but he basically says PayPal was, if you are at a company that's very successful and it's easy, then you learn the wrong lesson, which is that making internet companies is easy. If you're at a company and it's hard and it fails, then you learn the wrong lesson, which is you can't be successful. He said that what we learned at PayPal is that it was hard and we were successful. So we sort of learned the right lessons, which is it's not easy to do this, but you can actually have a success. There were generations of people who lost everything and sort of believed the internet was never going to come back, right? And many of them, by the way, were equally as smart, equally as talented. It was just a matter of timing and circumstance. In terms of Europe, my friend, the way we connected is you had interviewed my friend Sebastian Malaby. And, one of the things he identified is that there's always been venture capital was just more mature in the United States in that era, right? And a part of venture capital is certainly taking bets. They operate on the power law, right? So you sort of need one big win and many, many others can end up being either small successes or not successful. And I think that culture was in place even before the internet. And so, but at the same time, now today, I think that thesis about Europe is being proven wrong. The more you read, the more a lot of venture capital money has moved to Europe. There are more kind of unicorns in waiting, right? And so I think that's changing too.
Yeah, no, I think Europe has a lot of technology that needs capital to move forward. And before the crash in 2020, I think Europe was much cheaper than the United States, with also a lot of talent. But let's stay with your book and with PayPal before we drift off into discussing the European problems. Right. I'm curious, how much time did you invest in writing this book?
Yeah, this was 6 years, basically from start to finish. Yeah, it's the joke. One of the board members, after it was all done and it come out, he joked with me. He said, "You spent more time writing the book than I spent creating the company." And I was like, "That's pretty good." But no, so think about it. So people ask me, they're like, "How can you spend that much time on a book?" It's all sort of relative. Robert Caro, who's one of my favorite writers, spends 10 years on a book, right? So I think of it as I'm not quite at the Robert Caro level. But I think what's tricky is, there's a way to write this book very quickly. But the problem is when you're given 5 gigabytes of email and you have the opportunity to write it with a level of detail, you sort of, I would have felt bad if I only went through a few of those emails and tried to cobble it together, as opposed to really trying to go for detail. And you'll notice the book is very detailed, hopefully readable, but very detailed. And it's because I would wake up every day and just try to learn a little bit more, try to understand a little bit more. And I think that the challenge with a lot of writing about Silicon Valley, there's a bunch of challenges. We can get into what the challenges are, but it's there are narratives about Silicon Valley that if someone had done research, they would find out are not true, right? So like the common narrative, the one that was done in the movie about Mark Zuckerberg, like using Facebook to find a girlfriend, like it's like completely false, right? But it's because whoever wrote the book like wasn't interested in doing like really rigorous, like detailed, footnoted, endnoted research, and that's fine. That's like a style of writing. It's closer to novels than it is to nonfiction, right? But I was going for something where I wanted to let the facts drive the story because I thought the facts were crazy. Like I thought the facts and the people were crazy enough to carry the narrative. I didn't need to just like make stuff up. The problem is that in trying to get to the facts, it just takes a lot of time. You can imagine like Peter Thiel's door doesn't just swing open for anybody who emails him. Elon Musk isn't going to sit down with anybody who emails him. And so I had to take time and a lot of like patient effort to go through and like learn everything I could. That was kind of one part of it was that. The second reason it took that long is because there was a pandemic in the middle and I had a young kid and life happens, right? And then the third reason is I do all my books while working full time. So all my books are kind of like morning and weekend exercises. And so I was working the entire time. So like it maybe would have come down a little bit. But the truth is that what's powerful about spending I know people are like, oh, I could never spend, 6 years on something like this. And it's like, well, it's not that hard, really. Like it's boring. And most people fall off because I think they think it's boring. But the truth is, you wake up and you kind of improve your understanding about the topic every day. And so what would happen is like every day I would learn something new and it just added to my understanding. And then that's how long it took for me to feel like, okay, this book is readable, but also really rigorous. And I feel like I've gone to the max of what I can do in terms of people to interview, things like that. Now, I interviewed a lot of people, several hundred, but I did not interview everybody who worked there. Some people didn't write back. Sometimes timing didn't work out. But I tried to get to the key characters. That's the reason you asked for the sort of why of the 6 years. That was what was involved in those 6 years.
No, I absolutely understand that. Let's talk a little bit about your background. You said that you are not a full-time writer. Did I understand it right? Do you have a normal job like everybody else?
Well, the normal job is speech writing and ghost writing. So it's writing. I just write for other people, right? And so I do that during the day. And then I do the books kind of on the side. And obviously, like there's a little bit of, it mixes a bit. But the nice thing is like my main work is writing and my side hustles are writing. And so this was just kind of, I've done books before. So this was my first book, but this was the first book where I was dealing with subjects who were alive. And that is a different beast, especially when they're powerful and wealthy and, have a big public profile. That was a little different for me. It's not like my other books. I always joke with my friends, like it's so much easier to write about dead people. Like it's so much easier.
What's the difference? What's the difference?
Lawyers. I mean,
Really?
No, but in all seriousness, well, I think there's sort of two things. One is, if you are writing about somebody who's alive, they have the ability to comment on the quality of your work. If you're writing about somebody who's dead, they can't tweet about your book. And so there is like a fundamental difference, right? Which is just like, I was always writing from a place of, okay, what would happen? Not if I said something that was factually accurate and made the person a little uncomfortable. That's fine. That's the job, right? But if I got a fact wrong, that's really bad. Like that's not good. And it's not good because Elon has 120 million Twitter followers.
One tweet.
One tweet and you're like suddenly a different person, It's like very rare. It's like almost like a godlike power. You're like one tweet can change your life, And so you're in a situation where you're like, oh, I have to be very careful. But then the other thing is like, you have to be careful anyway. But that's the difference. The difference is, that the people who are going to read the book were also interview subjects for the book. And that like gets tricky. It's just hard. It's just like, you're always thinking in the back of your head, like, okay, how do I like find, how do I make sure that what I'm saying here is the truth?
So it was basically a back and forth. You interviewed the people, then you wrote a section, then you had to send the section to your interview partners.
No, I never sent material to the people I interviewed. That's kind of the agreement, because the problem is, if you I interviewed almost 300 people for this book.
300.
So I can't send the book out to 300 people and get feedback. That's just not going to happen. Number one. Number two, when you're writing about people who are busy and who are powerful, it's in some ways more respectful of like their time to not ask for feedback. But also, I would have felt weird because so think about it this way. Let me give you an example. In the middle of the story, Elon is pushed out as CEO. He is pushed out by his colleagues. Now, you can imagine that like Elon's version of that story and Max Levchin's version of that story are different because they're different people. They live differently. The goal of the author is not to bias one way or the other. The goal of an author for a book like this is to get the facts. And the facts you can have disagreements. And there were, by the way, disagreements. And so then what you do is you're trying to present an honest portrait. But imagine that I sent that chapter to Max Levchin before the book was published. And he was like, well, I disagree with this, and this. And then you send it to Elon. He's like, well, I disagree with this, this. Then you're caught in this impossible position of like, what are you going to do? And so you try to avoid. What I did was I did check factual things sometimes with the interviewers. Like I would make sure, like, for example, if it was something related to their families, I wanted to make sure, because there's not like public sources or emails, that I got that information correctly. A good example is I write about Max Levchin's grandmother in the opening chapter. Well, like, I don't know his grandmother, and like, and she's passed away, and I don't know anybody that knows her, and it'd be weird. And so there were some facts where I just had to go to him and say, look, I'm fact checking this. Can you verify that this is accurate? That this is her name, that this is et cetera, et cetera. And so that was part of the process. But then there's this secondary part of it where you try to respect that, like, they have to respect that you are going to do a good job with the facts, and they have to live with it. In fact, in some ways, they're in the worst position because, like, I can say whatever I want, right? They have to live with it. So,
no, I think the book is very good. It's extremely well written. I like it, and it's easy to read. As long as people are not like me, just checking their own notes. So it's just one page, then can last 4 hours delving into the past. You said you write full time, so you write during the day, and your night hours you spend with writing your books. How many words do you write per day?
Oh, that's a great question. No one's ever asked me that before. My books are generally in the morning. So from like very early in the morning, to like 8 or 9 a.m. And then weekends kind of all day. I would say on a given day, when I was really in it with the book and like really like, it was like pandemic, you couldn't do anything, I was like sometimes doing like 2,000, 3,000 words a day. Because it just, like that's kind of, you just get into a rhythm and then you keep doing it. Not all of those are publishable, but that was kind of my limit at some point, was 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. And that was like 7 days a week. I mean, that was pretty intense. I don't do that all the time, but when I'm in book mode, I'm kind of in a certain specific, my friends, they're like, oh, like, it's like Jimmy's like book world. So like, it's like becomes a different world.
How do you approach such a project? I mean, when you have the idea, so it's from end result, when we dissect the process back to the beginning, what is your work process? How do you dissect such a big project?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Because it's a long book, a lot of people interview, long process. So the place you start, at least the place I start, and the place that the writers that I know, who I really admire, where they start, is you start with your outline. So I had an editor who was pretty famous, who was like obsessive about like making sure that you got your outline right before you started writing, because your outline is basically like a very, very, very refined to-do list. And what's nice about a book like this is that I'm just writing chronologically, right? So I'm not writing about random times. I'm writing about 1998 to 2002. And there might be some stories in there from a couple of other places, but generally it's 1998, 99, 2000, 2001, 2002. And so what you end up doing is you write a really good outline. And I actually have like all my old outlines, and you work on those and you work on those and you work on those. And then when I felt like the outline was in a good place, that is when I used a software program called Scrivener, and I just created folders for the different years. and I would basically just dump material and thoughts and interview quotes and ideas and whatnot into there. And then I would work in Google Docs and Google Sheets for the chapters. So I'd sort of like know from my outline, okay, chapter 1 is Max Levchin, University of Illinois. Chapter 2 is Peter Thiel, Stanford, and him meeting Max. Chapter 3 is Elon in college, right? And so I sort of knew like, this is where I want to go. But it all starts from the outline, which is how you keep yourself from going totally, utterly crazy.
Yeah, it's I love that book. You mentioned Max Levchin. You wrote in, I think it was the first chapter, that he liked playing Tetris, and I learned that Tetris basically was invented in Russia. Was it a really Russian program?
It was invented in Russia. It was something I learned along the course of doing it, and it was one of these like things that he has a really good memory. Like one of the things that was great about interviewing him is he has a nearly photographic memory.
Wow.
And particularly around things related to computers and computer engineering. And so he could remember like every computer he used. He remembered every program he played. And one of the first things that he fell in love with was Tetris. I mean, I think like a lot of us, like it's like, I remember playing Tetris when I was a kid, but it was called Stakhan was the name of the game when it was originally created. And it was funny. You asked about fact checking. I had originally called it Tetris when I wrote like one of the drafts. And because it was a really personal detail and it was like from his childhood and there was nobody around to confirm it, I like was doing my fact checking. I said, oh, like you told me that you were playing, Tetris. And I was like, oh, no, I should have said that it was called Stakhan, like it was this Russian game. And so then I went and I did the research. I checked it out to make sure he wasn't lying to me. And then I was able to go with that.
Yeah, funny. We are the same generation then. So 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 48. I think he must be in his 50s, isn't he? So currently
I think he's 50s. Like late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, that's true. There are two things in your book that I would like to investigate a little bit further. I heard the first time that I heard the term PayPal Mafia was in a lecture Ma Hirschberg gave at the All In Summit spring. I think it was spring this year. And I thought PayPal Mafia, it's a little bit a funny term. Isn't it rude to say that? I mean, you have finance, you have PayPal, you have the most successful people, and then you call them a mafia. And then I read your book, and you also use the term PayPal Mafia. What's the origin of the term?
Yeah, and you'll get to it when you get to the end, but I can tell the story for your listeners. So just take a step back. You have a group of several hundred very talented people at this company. The company PayPal goes public in the spring of 2002, and it is acquired by eBay in the summer, like a late summer of 2002. A number of these people leave the company pretty soon thereafter. Not all of them, and in fact, a lot of them stay, and they have a variety of reasons why they stayed. But people like Peter Thiel and David Sachs, Reid Hoffman, Max Levchin, they all leave pretty quickly after eBay acquires the company. And what happens is between 2002 and 2007, they start to plant the seeds of all of the next generation of internet companies. So this is when LinkedIn comes into being. This is when SpaceX comes into being, Yelp, Palantir, a bunch of these other companies, Facebook, all that stuff starts to happen. And by 2006, there's an article that calls them the PayPal diaspora. There's this article, and I think it was like Forbes, like a writer called them the PayPal diaspora. A year later, a writer, I think it was Jeff O'Brien writing for Forbes, has this cover photo called a cover story called the PayPal Mafia. And I don't quite know where the term came from, but I know that they did a photo shoot at Tosca Cafe, which is this like Italian cafe in San Francisco. And they got a bunch of the people who were part of the company to dress up as mafiosos and do this cover story. Now it's like a really funny kind of thing, right? Because they're sort of like Silicon Valley tech people, right? But that name stuck, and that cover story from 2007 stuck. And so you'll see it actually like around the world. So, whenever a company goes public now around the world, they'll like refer to like that company and Mafia. So there's in Canada, it was like the WorkBrain Mafia. In India, it was like the Flipkart Mafia. There was the Revolut Mafia, the Monzo Mafia. There's a bunch of these in East Africa. This company Kopo like got acquired or went public, and they The founders talked about building the PayPal Mafia of East Africa, right? 3 days ago, not even kidding, 3 days ago, there was this story about Utah and about how there's all this venture money going into the state of Utah in the United States. And the person was like, they're trying to recreate the PayPal Mafia in Utah, right? And so it became this kind of brand. Now, it's not like, the weird thing about the name is that there's actually like some people who love it within the alumni group. Some people really don't like it. And most people just kind of roll their eyes because they're not nefarious. It's not as though all these people got together and started committing crimes, right? They just got together and started building more tech companies and like investing in technology. And so that was kind of this, like, it was sort of a half joke thing that became probably more serious than these people ever thought it would. I think that if like they knew what a thing it would become, they might not have participated in the photo shoot, you know, but that's what happened. And so that's the origin story of it, is this story in Fortune magazine from 2007. And I treated it fairly. I looked at, there's this great line that a board member gave me. He said, calling us a mafia is an insult to mafias. A mafia is far more organized than we were. And so there's some people who just, you know, what that person was implying and later said was, we weren't that cool. And like, we, you know, and it's sort of like nobody really had like some like plan. Like a lot of this was chance and circumstance. And so the mafia thing has a little bit of, you know, there can be some disagreements there, but that's the origin story of it.
What was this? You said chance and circumstance. Something was, can you dig a little bit deeper into that? Why chance and circumstance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about the timing of everything that happened in this story. By the way, I wouldn't call it, like, I think luck is the wrong word, right? Because actually a lot of, I mean, as you'll read in the book, and as you probably already read, there's a lot of hard work that goes into this. So it's not quite luck. But if you think about the timing of the company, you know, PayPal gets created in late 1998 and 1999, and it takes off on eBay in late 1999. But eBay had already acquired a payment system. They just didn't integrate it very well. And so if maybe PayPal had been created in 2000, there wouldn't have been room for PayPal to be successful on eBay because eBay would have done a better job of integrating this company that they acquired called BillPoint. If PayPal had come 1 year earlier, maybe they would have focused on a different corner of the payments market. If PayPal had become 1 year later, they might not have been able to raise venture capital. They close a $100 million venture capital round in March of 2000, a few weeks before the bottom falls out on the stock market and the bubble starts bursting. So there's all of these things that like the timing is very like, oh my, you know, like things happen at the right moment, right? And I think that's like what I mean when I say that to describe them as the PayPal Mafia in 2007 suggests that PayPal was well planned from 1998 to 2002. But it really, like, they faced so many challenges and they overcame them. But the company went through many, many, many different iterations along the way. That's what I mean, that like chance and circumstance were a part of this. The engineering talent, the availability of talent, the people they recruited, the fact that Max and Peter met at Stanford at this like little room, the fact that Peter went from investor to CEO, the fact that Elon was involved and was able to bring capital and heft and his talented people. Like there's all these things that like you can't kind of say like, oh, it was all designed to get to that Fortune magazine cover with the PayPal Mafia. And they knew in 1998, they knew 9 years later they were all going to be at a photo shoot and they were going to call themselves the PayPal Mafia and it was all going to work out. Like nobody knew that. I mean, that'd be crazy.
How do we get on we get the cover story on Fortune?
Right.
I didn't know. So when I read the book, I didn't know that the first product of PayPal was basically the idea of beaming money.
And actually, and it's funny. It's actually that's one product removed. You know, so the first company. So just to take a step back, because listeners who may have not have read the book or be familiar with the story. You know, we use PayPal today. And if you don't use PayPal, maybe use Venmo or like one of their affiliated companies. And PayPal is really the union of two companies. The first company was created by Max Levchin and Peter Thiel in 1998. It was called Confinity. The other company was created in early 1999 by Elon Musk, and it was called X.com. They both had payments products. They weren't originally, either of them, focused on email or digital payment. That was actually like one product of many for X.com, and it was a later iteration for Confinity. Confinity's first product was actually this series of like mobile encryption libraries. So they were trying to encrypt information on Palm Pilots and other early PDAs. So, you know, your younger listeners might think of a Palm Pilot as something that's supposed to be in a museum, but you and I, you know, we're closer to it than they are. They were early iPhone.
I was desperate to get a Palm Pilot back in the 90s. So it's the early iPhone, basically, without the telephone and internet access.
It was the early iPhone without the phone part, right? And way worse apps. But Max Levchin was really interested in the idea of encrypting information on these devices. Those mobile encryption libraries evolved to encrypting money, and encrypting money evolved to, hey, could we like use the Palm Pilots to beam money, like send money from one person to another through the infrared port on the Palm Pilot, which, by the way, like that technology, we laugh at it, but that's Venmo, right? Like it's basically Venmo. It's like mobile payments made easy for everyone. They were just 20 plus years too early for that because not everybody had a PDA, very limited ceiling on the product success. But that was actually the first big breakout product that Confinity, Peter and Max's company, created. It was called PayPal, and the idea was you would beam money across these infrared ports, and that was their first innovation. And their theory of the case, or their use case, was if I'm at lunch with you, Christian, and you pay for lunch, and I need to give you $10. What if we just take out our Palm Pilots and I give you $10, right? And it sounded ludicrous back then to people. They actually called it like one of the 10 worst business ideas of 1999 or something in some magazine. But today we do that with Venmo, or we do that with, you know, Zelle or any, you know, all these other quick payment systems on phones.
Now we didn't have the technology back then. I was part of research projects with Harvard, University of Graz, University of St. Gallen, for the government to find out how will the internet change the industries. So we had a lot of ideas in the 90s back then, but not the technology. And when you said beaming money, I mean, I think the first time I saw it was actually in China.
Really?
WeChat. So where people sat there and one paid the bill and the other one transferred money via WeChat. And I thought, why don't we have that in Europe? It would be so cool. I think it was 2016 or 2017.
Yeah. Well, you know, Europe has actually like been ahead on a bunch of, like, even further than the United States. Maybe I think China is its own sort of ecosystem. I think it's like, I don't understand it well enough to like really know. But Europe has always actually been a payments innovator, you know, on these sorts of like the technology. I've just noticed it and I've read about it a little bit. But yeah, so that's where the origin story starts, is Palm Pilot money beaming. And that is where the idea came from.
And I think, did I remember it right? I think David Sachs killed beaming. Was it David Sachs? We could have beaming right now. So
yeah, I would say, you know, the patient was on life support when David Sachs killed it. We should take a step back though, because actually it's a very interesting moment. I write a lot about it in the book. So one of the challenges that was explained to me by the people I interviewed, and I actually should say that to your listeners, I'm not in tech. I spent a lot of time picking these people's brains and trying to understand technology through their eyes, meaning have Elon Musk like explain to you, you know, that sort of thing. And so everything I say, I sort of, my reference points are like interviews I've done or interviews I've listened to or research from emails, things like that. One of the things I heard from multiple people, particularly Max Levchin, is that when you create a technology, even if it is not successful, you tend to fall in love a little bit with your technology. Because what happens is you sunk cost fallacy. You feel like, whoa, I've spent all of this time and engineering bandwidth and energy into building this Palm Pilot money beaming thing. It's going to work. We're going to make it work. It's going to be successful, right? What happened in the summer of 1999 at Confinity was that they had built this money beaming technology and also built a companion technology to make the transfers easier, which was emailing, meaning I could, you know, email Christian@yahoo.com. I could email you $10. We could also have our Palm Pilot transaction. It very quickly became clear that emailing money was like where people were excited because it simplified the cumbersome process of digital payments. There was still no clear digital payments player. Max Levchin had fallen in love with the Palm Pilot encrypted money beaming on these small devices. And one of the things that happens in the company is there's this kind of existential argument, an existential debate in the summer of 1999. David Sacks is a friend of Peter Thiel's from Stanford, and Peter's been trying to recruit David to come to the company. And one of the things that David says is like, he basically comes in and he's like, this Palm Pilot money beaming thing is so stupid. We have to kill this. Like, this is so dumb. And there's a ceiling on its success and there's gonna be no network effects. And how do people even use it? He says, but if your company will focus on emailing money, I will quit my job at McKinsey right now and come and join you. And Peter kind of essentially makes that's part of the bargain. He's like, all right, we're going to focus on emailing money. But when David arrives, that memo had not been communicated widely. And so David comes in and starts telling the team, like, we have to shift our focus to emailing money. He is one part of the reason why the company did that. I think it's inaccurate to say he's the sole reason, because eventually Max says, yeah, David's right. Like, let's focus on this. The board, it says like, well, look at your user growth on email versus your user growth on Palm Pilot. It's very simple. It's very, like, you know, these things move quickly. They're very natural past a certain point. But David is also the person in the room, and this is why I write a lot about him. You know, one of the other the sort of learnings I had during this process is it's actually, people fall in love with the technology so much that they fall in love with they forget about the end user of the technology. And so you sort of create the perfect mousetrap, but you forget who's actually going to be using the mousetrap. David, somebody had this great line about David that I actually didn't end up including in the book. I maybe should have, but he said, you know, David was one of the only people that cared as much as he did about the end user, about PayPal's end user, as opposed to like everything else. And he would often be the person in the room who, you know, sometimes forcefully would say, well, how is a user actually going to use this? Or like, what's a user actually going to do here? This extended to everything. I had a designer who worked on international currency conversion tell me that like David was ruthless about saying like, you can't make even currency conversion hard for people. You have to make it simple and then explain everything else somewhere else. And that role ended up being kind of called product, but that was not really a thing in 1998, 1999. But David Sacks became effectively the head of product, the VP of product, and later the COO of the company. And his character, you know, he is this clarifying voice. Like, that's what he is. He is a clarifier. And what he does is he'll come into the room, and he's like, I often got the reputation of being Dr. No. And I sort of asked, like, what does that mean? He said, well, think about it. You have a bunch of people who think that the thing they're creating that day is the most important thing. But he said, we are very limited in engineering bandwidth. And so I needed to be the person saying, no, we have to prioritize. We have to have discipline. We have to actually like say like, this is more important than this. And I need you working on this. And so he said, so I just got a reputation within the company of like, Dr. No. That's the backstory on the evolution from Palm Pilot money beaming to emailing money. And it wasn't automatic. When they first discovered that they're having success on eBay, a bunch of people on the PayPal team, the Confinity team that's running it, are like, well, we don't want any part of this. eBay is terrible. It's like a flea market, you know, people selling junk on the internet. We don't want that. And it's David and other voices who say, no, this is product market fit. Like, this is actually, we've achieved something here and we need to continue to fuel this fire.
Yeah, I think product market fit and making things easy for the customer is one of the most important key success factors in US-based companies. I think Apple, for example, Steve Jobs. I think the difference between iPhone and European mobile phones back then was it's just easy for the user. So the innovation at the Apple iPhone for me was when I switch to the next version of the iPhone, I can take my whole profile with me to the next phone. It's so easy. It's so simple. And the European phones, every time when I got a new one, it was 2003, 4 or 5 or in the 90s, I had to relearn everything. So it took one day to just set up the phone so that I can use it the way I wanted to use it. I think this product market fit should be at the top of every company, and probably David Sacks is one of those the people that created the success at PayPal with just demanding it from their technicians to just think from the customer's perspective, not from your perspective. Is it the right impression?
Oh, and that's 100% accurate. And I would argue that it's actually, and it's funny that you mentioned Steve Jobs, because I've often thought that the sort of personality type that David is closest to is Steve Jobs. What he is trying to do is reduce friction and reduce irritation. And there were at the time, this is early web, this is dial-up internet days. So irritation was a big deal. If somebody had a slight delay, that was a problem. And you're trying to compete for users, you're running out of money, you're trying to grow this company. Irritation and friction are a big thing. And David was sort of this person who was just like constantly, relentlessly at war with anything extraneous that would interfere with the user experience. And I think like this sounds very simple, right? What I just said sounds very simple. People are like, oh, that sounds self-evident. But imagine being on a team and having to tell your colleagues, like everything you've done for the last 9 months is like needs to be discarded, and I need you to shift your focus entirely to something else. That's a hard thing to do. Like that's not actually easy. And by the way, you get resistance, but not just emotional resistance. You get sort of intellectual resistance. There was this thing that Max Levchin shared with me. He was still maintaining the Palm Pilot app like a year and a half into the success of the emailing money product, right? And at one point, like it was like late at night and he was in the office and Peter Thiel arrived at the office. Peter said, oh, Max, what are you working on? He's like, oh, I'm just doing bug fixes for the Palm Pilot product. And Peter like lost it. He was like, wait, you're the CTO of the company and we have this successful product. You need to stop this like Palm Pilot thing. That can't happen anymore because your time is limited too. And so I think that's a big part of understanding it. People have this impression that like, oh, you just create an emailing money product and it's super successful and everybody uses it and network effects and virality. No, these are decisions and this is leadership. And it is somebody like David Sacks saying, he had this line that his team would repeat to me. It's funny, I interviewed all these members of his product team and each of them separately would say to me, yeah, David would always say, it has to be as easy as email, as easy as email, as easy as email. And then they put up a sign around the office with David Sacks' face that said, as easy as email. And this was a big part of the culture was people understood that part of David's role was saying, have we made this like as easy for the user as possible, as easy as email? And I think that's very important. These are not just technologies that like spring into life and like everything is beautiful and perfect. They are very rough pieces of stone and they're kind of like polished from all these different angles. And David was one of the people that again, that's not my assessment. It's his colleagues' assessment is he was sometimes difficult to work with, but he cared so much about the end user and the end user experience.
Yeah, difficult to work with. I work with scientists since 2006. And a lot of the scientists are at research organizations, so I've been at research organizations. And the thing is, research at the research organization sparks curiosity, and scientists learn and are trained into finding new things. So basically, they do one small study, then they find something new, they pivot to the next small study, and then they find something new again and do the next thing. But when they want to translate scientific results into products, they have to shift their mindset from being creative. And I think this is, it sounded to me like what Max Levchin was doing at PayPal. So he was focusing his attention on creating something new. But when you want to turn it into a company, you have to do one thing, focus on one thing only and focus on the right thing that the customer needs. And this is, in my opinion, really difficult for scientists because they are trained differently.
Right. I think the thing that's interesting about David and Max, and it's good, it's like interesting you identify them because that's what in the book as well, they work really well together. The amazing thing about PayPal is that as intense as these debates, some of these existential debates often were, even 20 years later, I didn't hear from people like, oh man, I hated working. It was more, I respected that somebody like Max was like trying to do something, and that I respected that David was trying to do something. By the way, it was a very intense culture. There was a fair amount of debate and argument and like a lot of hours, but it was also respectful in the kind of like, it was intensely focused on getting to the right answer of of what the product should do. Not like, I don't like, person, or I don't like this, how, it's more sort of getting to the truth required a kind of intensity. I would say that the thing that surprised me, I don't think even like anybody who is outside of the world of technology understands that any little decision for a web services company or a website, if it's important, like actually has a fair amount of thought behind it, and like debate and argument. We just don't think in those terms. Like the web works so fluidly now, we sort of notice the mistakes, but we don't notice all the work that goes into preventing those mistakes. And I found that was like one of the most interesting things that David's team, this alumni from the product group at PayPal, they said to me, so many of my product instincts for later work were shaped by my time with David. Because what would happen is that you would go into him, and if you had like something that you had made you thought was beautiful, he would like give you very critical feedback. You had to sort of be ready for that. And they said, I carried that into my future work. So I think it's like one of the things that it surprised me. It was a really valuable series of things to investigate and learn, was just like what that role is. What is product? Well, product is partly, not entirely, but partly thinking very concretely about the end user.
And making it easy for the end user, and not, I would say, patting the technicians on the back for the great work they did when nobody uses it. So it's really tough.
And nobody uses it. Yeah.
And then staying also on a respectful level, so that people can work together even when they have arguments. I think this is very, very difficult.
Yeah. Oh, it's hugely difficult. By the way, part of it is, I sort of like to say that like this book should not be read as a book of chemistry. It's alchemy, right? That like, actually, like, it's not that you have like, oh, just find yourself like, a David and an Elon and a whatever. It's more that actually what you want to understand is, do you have like, if you're a business owner, maybe the lesson from David Sachs, or sort of the question you need to be asking yourself is, who on the team is like obsessed with how the end user thinks and uses our product, right? That's a powerful question to ask.
Yeah, you can spend a lot of time. I mean, focus is also a term that you mentioned. You can spend a lot of time working on the wrong thing and failing tremendously. With a small shift, you can sometimes take out half the time, 50% of the time.
Or think about, let's take an example that's not from PayPal. Famously, one of the first things that Steve Jobs does when he returns to Apple the second time around is he kills basically all the products. There's like dozens of things they're working on, and he just sort of takes a blowtorch to them and says, we're not going to do any of those things. We need to focus, right? And I think that's very hard to do. It's hard at the interpersonal level because people feel an emotional commitment to their work. And when you come in and you say their work is no longer needed or valuable, or like they're doing things that shouldn't be done, that's a really hard thing to manage, even if you have the right answer.
But I think this is the core of entrepreneurship, focusing on customer demand and making it as easy and simple as possible for the customer. And this makes a huge difference, in my opinion. Yeah. You mentioned also the term friction. There was another friction just came to my mind when I read through your book, and it was quite interesting because I didn't expect it. So I read Founders, I saw the cover, paper, cool. I like the colors as well, blue and white, white and black. And then I came to the table of contents, and I needed a second look to find it, because I read, okay, building blocks, the pitch, then you have the Nuthouse Coup and Igor, and then you have divided the book into 3 sections. Right. Part 1, part 2, part 3. And then I thought, wait a minute, Sicilian defense, I know that from chess. So from chess. And then I read the second part, Bad Bishop, I know that from chess. And then the third part, and I thought, I know that as well from chess. And what did I get the wrong book? Is it a chess book or something like that? And why chess? Why did you name the 3 parts after chess opening, after chess problems?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. You're one of there are not many people who pick up on that, because those are specific sequences in chess, or like kind of moves you can make, or situations. The story might, like, the answer might be somewhat unsatisfying, but let me roll with it. But basically, one of the things I learned is how much puzzle solving and game playing and kind of that whole ecosystem, that was such a part of PayPal's culture, was like this competitiveness around problem solving and puzzles and chess and logic games, things like that. And so one of the players, Peter Thiel is an exceptional chess player. He was I think he was ranked at one point like the youngest player under the age of 13 or 14 in America or something. And he had achieved whatever it is, like whatever status rankings those are. David Sachs is a very good chess player. Max Levchin's a very good chess player. Like on and on. Like he just got good chess player after good chess player. And I started thinking about like what are like just, design elements in the book and like ways you could make the book a little bit more clever. And I realized like I was already writing kind of part 1, part 2, part 3. But then I thought about like, well, in chess, that's like the opening, the middle game, and the end game, right? And so I picked three chess kind of sequences or moves that sort of graphed onto the opening and Sicilian defense. The part of the Sicilian defense is that it's a move by a weaker party. Like, so it's like, you're sort of like, it's like a more aggressive move from black, I guess, that like, because you're in a weaker position, because you're moving second. So a little bit of an aggressive, and like, I got the sense like, okay, PayPal was always in the weaker position, right? They were always like less money than their competitors. They were always fighting eBay. They were always fighting somebody. I was like, all right, that sounds like it's about right. The middle one, bad bishop. The bad bishop happens when the bishop cannot make a move. Like you sort of have this very powerful piece, the bishop, but it's stuck in place and kind of can't do what it needs to do. And there were 2 leadership transitions in the middle of the book that are very messy. And like the leaders, their explanation would have been like, I couldn't do the things I needed to do, And so I was like, okay, that works metaphorically. And then the last one was doubled rooks. And doubled rooks is this situation in chess where you have 2 rooks and it allows you to sort of finish the game by moving the rooks and having them advance and checkmate the king. And the way the story of PayPal ends is with an IPO, rook number 1, and with the acquisition by eBay, which is rook number 2. And so it was pure kind of like just metaphor. It wasn't anything specific, but it was also in some ways an homage to the culture. I wanted the book to be reflective of the culture. So I was like, okay, chess is a good way to do it. There's also a secret puzzle buried in the middle of the book. So like, that's the other thing I did, was I buried a secret code in the book, was my other thing that I layered through.
Oh, yeah, I didn't get that yet, I think.
It's very specific.
I'm at page 155, so I have a little bit to go.
Yeah.
Sicilian defense also fits very nicely into the PayPal Mafia narrative. And
yes, that's right.
Now you made me curious. What's the secret puzzle in the book? So.
Oh, well, I'm not going to reveal it. I'm happy to have people dig for it and then find it. And actually, a few people have solved it, including Max Levchin. Funny enough, after the book was done, I sent him a copy, and he's the first person to crack the code and like wrote me like as soon as he cracked it, which is pretty funny.
Really, really. And is there a prize or so that people can win when they crack it?
I didn't think about that, but if somebody's listening and they crack the code, I will gladly send them a signed copy of the book.
Okay, good to know.
Up to a certain number, but let's like put it out there. If you shoot me a DM on Twitter or shoot me an email, and if you've cracked the code and you give me your address, I'll send you a signed copy of the book. Because it's not an easy code to crack, and so for somebody to do it, I'm like, all right, you're invested. Let's make it worth your while.
So I will put it in a clip afterwards and promote it on LinkedIn and YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, and maybe
end up having to give away like 100 signed copies of the book if people crack it. But I'll set a limit, a personal limit. But for anybody that solves it, feel free to reach out to me.
The bad bishop also, I always thought, who's the bad bishop? So it's but it's a situation. So it's this 2 CEO situation and not particularly. And
again, it's a metaphor. The word bad has all these sort of like connotations. It's more of the company at different moments felt stuck in place. And I walk readers through all sides of it, meaning how did the leaders feel? What were they facing? And how did the people who were being led feel when the company slows down? And startups don't really slow down. And so the company goes through this slowdown in 2000, and it's because of some leadership transitions. And that's kind of what I was like, oh, the bishop feels, stuck in place, like you can't go anywhere. And the bishop becomes not valuable as a piece on the board. And that was like when I was reading about it, I was like, okay, this sort of fits with the whole motif.
There is also another thing that came to my mind when I read the first 150 pages of the book. So PayPal basically is a group of people that were thinking very hard about improving their payment systems. And Elon Musk, for example, with X.com, he wanted to have, as far as I remembered from your book, a one-stop shop, basically for all solutions that you need in your financial life. And also Peter Thiel spent a lot of time thinking about how to improve payments. Max Levchin with the Palm Pilot money beaming product, which is quite good. I think I also sometimes read about cryptography. So that this was a huge problem when people wanted to beam money from one Palm Pilot to another Palm Pilot, how to make it safe and secure. And then we had the dot-com bubble burst, 2000. We had another crash in 2007-8. Then the Forbes article came out, PayPal Mafia. And then all at the same time, I think in 2008, Bitcoin appeared. A mysterious person or group like Satoshi Nakamoto invented Bitcoin to make transactions safer, more secure, more reliable, more trustworthy without having a system in between. And when you look, for example, at the Twitter acquisition that happened recently by Elon Musk and also the aftermath of that, there is one thought that sticks in my mind. Is it possible that the PayPal Mafia invented Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's a great question. How do I explain this?
It's like it's purely speculative, I guess. So it's,
no. And here's the thing: I did not set out to find out the true identity of Satoshi Nakamoto. That was not my ambition.
Sorry to interrupt you. But I think there was one part that let me just check it.
Yes, page, that's right. There was.
Peter Thiel mentioned. Peter Thiel said that at a convention somewhere in 2001, 2, 3, or sometimes it might have been that Satoshi Nakamoto was part of that convention.
So here's the story. It's actually a great story. It's very. You're a careful reader because people would have missed that. When Max and Peter are getting started in this sort of universe, one of the things that is an early branding tagline for Confinity and for the product PayPal. Confinity, by the way, was the company. PayPal was the product until a few years into it. One of their taglines was New World Currency. And the idea was if you could make phones like have currency on them, then like, why would anybody need paper money? Why would you need coins? It's like expensive and cumbersome. And it became this like real thing in their minds. Like, what could you use Palm Pilots to eliminate currencies? They were also coming at the tail end of a bunch of financial crises. So people forget, but like in the mid 90s, you know, the Asian financial crisis and collapses different kind of like currency values around the world. And so they attend these conferences in Anguilla. And this is like an island and it's called the International Financial Cryptography Association, the IFCA. And they present in 1999 and in 2000. And they're sort of met with some hostility, like because they're coming in and saying, hey, we have this Palm Pilot thing, you can like dissolve currencies. But it's not like they're the first people to have the idea that like maybe currencies could be more efficient. And so they're sort of like, they're treated like, you know, like parvenus, like they're sort of like treated like, oh, you're an Arabies, like, what are you doing here? You know, like, and that, but when they are there, it's the world's collection of like academics, cyberpunks, like it's like all these people who are in and around that universe. And Peter, you know, I think he said this line in a few places, but he was joking about it when I asked him about it. He said, you know, like you sort of like if you lose your car keys, like the most likely place to look is like, you know, wherever you last were with your car or whatever. And he said, you know, something like that. And he goes, if you are looking for Satoshi Nakamoto, like a likely place is like these conferences in Anguilla where all these people who are working on digital currency go. And so one of his theories is like, we might have been in the room with Satoshi at that conference. Now, do I think some alumni from this group, do I think they have the skills to be Satoshi Nakamoto? For sure. There's a few people in this room with like outlier level intellect. Like this is the kind of project they would want to take on. There's a bunch of people who think like Elon is Satoshi. I don't think that's the case. for a variety of reasons, mostly because at the time that Bitcoin drops, and sort of whoever is Satoshi starts to send those emails, Elon is very engaged in SpaceX and Tesla. Like it just wouldn't make sense. Like, and there's a variety of other reasons, but I was intrigued by this like conference, right? So I sort of read up on Anguilla and I read up on the conference, and you can still go see the papers that were presented back then, right? And I will say, like, that seems to be a plausible theory. Now, I think the world, like around the planet, people have all of these different theories of who Satoshi is. And I just don't have enough knowledge to know what's true and what's false. Like, it's not my particular, I'm not on some detective hunt for who Satoshi is. But from my perspective, it provided context. And the context is, before PayPal arrives, people have been trying to make digital money transfer work, digital currencies work. There were all these like DigiCash, there were all these bankruptcies that had just happened, right? This was very, very early crypto. And into that world steps these two people and this whole team eventually. And you know what? Like, to their credit, like they didn't listen to the critics. Like the critics said, like, oh, you're never going to get anywhere with this PayPal thing. That sounds so foolish, right? Nobody's going to beam money between Palm Pilots. Like, that's like, we've been trying this. You guys don't know what you're doing. And they cracked one code on how to make the digital money transfer work, in spite of the criticism that they got at this conference, right? And so I think that, I think it's an interesting part of the story. But you're right, Satoshi is mentioned, but I don't think I don't know, but I don't think anybody from the alumni group here is Satoshi Nakamoto.
The PayPal Mafia invented Bitcoin. This would be a great conspiracy theory.
Not mine. You can, go ahead. If the conspiracy theory helps me sell a few books, great. But otherwise,
we should invent this conspiracy channel. So
right, I should connect it to the code. It should actually be like the code will reveal who Satoshi is.
Yeah, but I think Elon Musk later promoted more Dogecoin. So maybe it was the cover for inventing Bitcoin.
Oh boy, I don't know. I think that's a very, the challenge with most conspiracies is most conspiracies are too elaborate to pull off. Like it's like just but yeah, I think I will say that the part about it that's interesting is studying DigiCash and studying some of these early. You look at the language around some of the early beans, flues, all of these things, and they track very closely with a lot of the taglines of cryptocurrency. And so sort of, the sort of joke would be like, everything old is new again, even cryptocurrencies, Yeah.
And I think what impresses me is I know the world in the 90s. So Europe was mostly based on cash. Also credit cards were not widespread. And what impresses me is people like Elon Musk, like Peter Thiel, Max Levchin, but also others like Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, who have an idea and have the guts and the nerves to focus on bringing the idea to life. Now, looking back from 2022, seeing what their companies changed in the world and what they brought to fruition is really interesting and amazing to see.
And I think part of it is, one way to tell the story is as a story of compromise, right? So think about it this way. It's not as though there was some pure vision of a new world currency, and then PayPal held fast to that vision even as they became successful on eBay. The truth is the team shifted very quickly to saying, we have product market fit on eBay. We need to cater to this digital auction marketplace. You could argue that, and some people did in my interviews with them, that actually it was sort of abandoning the original vision in some ways. But that's the work of startups, is this delicate dance between your highest and best goals and the hard reality of what the market is looking for. And what the market on eBay was looking for in late 1999 and in early 2000 was a seamless way to make digital payments. And no one had figured that out until this group, and no one had really made it as user-friendly as this group did.
There are a lot of fantastic points in your book. One point that also made me think. Today I was at the hairdresser, and the lady asked me, "So what are you currently reading?" And I said, "Of course, your book." So a little bit of promotion. And then she asked me, "What is it about?" And I said, "Well, I'm 48 now, and in the 90s I had this struggle that should I get my degree? So should I finish university? Should I get my master's degree? Should I do a PhD? Or should I leave university, found companies, and try something else? And always I thought it was just me that had this struggle. And then I read your book and found the story about Elon Musk, and it sounded to me, or maybe it was just interpreting my reality into your book, that Elon Musk also had a similar struggle back in the 90s. So it's basically, it was not such a given that he went straight into entrepreneurship. He also had opportunities at the university level. Did I interpret too much, or was it really that way?
No, your interpretation is exactly right. I mean, I can't speak for your personal circumstances, but so to sort of take a step back, part of the value of doing a book like this is that I was allowed to ask the people that I was interviewing about the earliest moments in their life. Mm-hmm. PayPal, by the time I'm writing about it, these people are all 20 years removed from PayPal. Like Elon is well into his, I think I first spoke to him in 2019, well into his Tesla and SpaceX years. So this is like ancient history, right? Actually, it's funny, I didn't put this in the book, but he joked with me. He, like, the first time we're speaking about it, he was like, man, like, you're like writing about like the Paleolithic era. Like, we haven't even moved on to land, like human beings haven't even moved on to land yet. We're just a bunch of cells, So in looking back, you sort of look back at their lives in college. Like, how do these people become who they became? What are the decisions, Because it's really tempting to like look at somebody like that and say, well, maybe you were always going to do this, but it's actually genuinely now almost never the case that you know exactly what someone's going to do when they're in their late teen years or early 20s. That was true for Elon. He had transferred from a Canadian university to the University of Pennsylvania. And at the University of Pennsylvania, during those later years, he's doing internships in Silicon Valley. And, he's kind of faced with this like very classic choice. He applies for and is admitted to graduate school at Stanford. He is thinking about startups because like the first series of web companies have just gone public. Netscape has just gone public. People are becoming really successful. He knows technology and enjoys it. He knows how to write code. And then the last decision is like, do I just get a real job? Like, do I just apply to get a real job? And I found, people in his life who were kind of helping him make this decision and like figure out what to do. And I was blown away. And the reason I was blown away is probably the same reason you were blown away, which is you think of him as a certain model of success, confident, intelligent, drives really hard, knows exactly what is to be done. But when he was at that age, there was far more indecision at that time in his life. Like, do I get a real job? Do I go to grad school or do I create my own startup? And they all carry different kinds of risks, but it was fun picking apart and like trying to understand like what is the thinking, who is influencing him, what time do these decisions happen? And so I got a real kick out of studying that part of his life. It also led me to like, I discovered, for example, like he applied to get a job at Netscape. He didn't get a response. So he went to the lobby in Netscape and just like stood around trying to strike up a conversation. And he was too shy. And so he like left without having a conversation. And I just thought it was such like so funny. You think of this like person today who is like at the top of the world and is like doing all these things he's doing, like struggling to get a job because he can't talk to anybody in the lobby of this building. And I don't know, I just found it, sometimes when you're writing, you think about your audience. And one of my audiences for this book, I think in my mind was somebody who's, let's say, between the age of like 15 and 25. And they're kind of like facing the same decision that a lot of us face when we're in school and trying to figure out what our lives might look like. And I think there is something comforting about knowing that maybe one of the people that you would look up to didn't have it all figured out when he was in his like late teens and 20s. He was smart and he had done very well in school and like he had clearly demonstrated some promise and some talent, but it wasn't as though he or Max or Peter or anybody like had a clear plan, And I think I wrote about it because I was like, people should know this. Like they should know that this person kind of was like deciding, like, do I defer my graduate school? Do I drop out? What do I do? Like, how do I create a company? Who do I create it with? So that was the impetus behind writing so much about a story that in some ways it's pre-PayPal. It's not quite PayPal. There's some links and connections, but I wrote about that because I was like, wow, it wasn't just like success after success after success. It was actually this process of figuring out who he is.
No, I think it's definitely helpful for people between 15 or 25 and also people in their 50s to see that struggling is normal. So this is part of life. And also the big winners and the most accomplished entrepreneurs of our times also face the same situations like everybody else. And it's just up to how they decide what to do, keeping on hard work, focus to move forward. We can run now through all stories and chapters of your book, but I think we need about 20 hours then, or 30 hours or 40
right,
hours.
Exactly.
You spent 6 years in research.
Right, exactly.
Maybe we can strip it down to the, before we come to the final question, with the 3 most inspiring moments of that book for you. So which were the 3 moments or stories that inspired you the most? I mean, it's just because of lack of time. Yeah. So we can't sit here.
No. And I would say there are like 30 or 40, truthfully, but I'll try to come up with 3. I would say one key story is there's this in chapter 15. I write about this engineer whose name is Bob Frezza, and Bob Frezza was a young Stanford person who interned at the company. He kind of comes to his internship a little circuitously. And Bob passes away when he's like 20 years old. I think he was like 2nd or 3rd year at Stanford. And his last job, on Earth was working at PayPal. And the team and the family develop a real connection. The team makes a memorial book for Bob's family. Bob was one of the people behind one of the most important technologies that made PayPal successful, which was fraud fighting. He was very young, very, very young, but he was kind of this extraordinary person. And I learned a lot about him in the course of doing all of this research. I was in touch with his family. I watched videos of him. Like there was some video from his high school graduation that I watched. I found this site that was dedicated to like his friends when he passed away, put up like a memorial site, and they would all put memories of Bob. And Bob was this really, his full name was Robert Frezza Jr., but he went by Bob. But Bob was this really extraordinary person. And I think one of the inspiring things from that moment is his age was not an impediment to his contribution to the company. Like he really made a big difference and like had a long lasting impact. And he was maybe like one of the youngest or second youngest person on the team. So I think that's really important for people to remember. I would say that second inspiring moment or kind of thing from the book, I had a lot of time interviewing the people who are at the top of the company, and many of them mentioned this board member, John Malloy. And John is not he's not famous, and he would prefer not to be famous. I think he was actually a little bit sheepish and a little uncomfortable that I was even writing about him. When he finished the book at the end, he said to me, he's like, you put me, like, he's like, I'm in this book way too much. And I was like, well, you're important. John is this mentor figure for this group of people. And the reason he's in the book as much as he is because Max and others said, you really do need to tell the story of like how many times it was important that we had somebody like John, who's sort of like an older brother type figure, but really on the board. And it made me think about how many people within companies and company stories like don't ever actually get attention, but play very significant roles. Even if those roles are not like designing technology or refining the product, just this sort of like almost like a godparent role in a company, right? So I think that was like, I don't know if it's inspiring, but it made me think about that, like within companies, like who's playing that role. Mm-hmm. The last thing I would say is at the very end of chapter 14, again, sort of spoiler alert, Musk is kicked out of the company. In the 4 years
nobody knew that.
Right. In the 4 years that I'm writing about Elon's life, he gets kicked out of the company. Mm-hmm. He almost dies because of a car crash. He almost dies because of malaria and meningitis. And he loses a child. And in spite of all of that, like any one of the things I just mentioned could like break another human being, right? Could like lead you to just be like, look, I have money. I'm going to go sit on a beach for the rest of my life. Like I'm done. Right after all of those experiences is essentially really in that whole period is when he starts SpaceX. And I find that to be very inspiring because I think if any one of those things happened to me, I'm not sure I could recover from it. The truth is, like, you know, that is those four things in sequence, like 2 near-death experiences, being kicked out of the company you created, and losing a child. Those are all difficult things stacked over, like in that short of a time frame. They're I mean, almost insurmountable. He overcomes all of them. You know, becomes an investor and then later the leader of Tesla and starts SpaceX. That's pretty amazing. That is not the part of his story that often gets covered today. People don't really pay attention to it. And by the way, I don't think he doesn't sit around talking about it. He's not like, that's not like, I drew that out from him and then from the different pieces of the story that I put together. It's really incredible to think about somebody doing that because there's a part of being an entrepreneur that is just about endurance and about having more at bats, right? And I think that's actually like one of the things that people forget about his life is, particularly in these years, it was very difficult. You know, this like affects his relation, affects his marriage. Everything was affected by all of these things. And I just think that's like something worth appreciating. Like, you know, humans have the most astounding ability to overcome. It's like one of the things I love best about writing biographies and these kinds of stories is just understanding what the capacity of human beings is. And I found that to be a particularly like crazy moment. Like months after some of these things happened, he is back at it, trying to do it again.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to point at these stories. They should be told more often, that after all, also the big heroes of our days are, after all, humans who make the same experiences like all others, with maybe one difference. They don't continue dwelling on the problems they had in the past, and they just learn to let go and move forward, while other people...
Yeah, and welcome to the signature challenge of writing a book about the past, which is if you're interviewing people who do move forward and who don't dwell, it's actually it's like a weird experience in some ways because they thought it was so strange that anyone would care. Like if I had so many people skeptical of the project, not because they didn't like want to talk about it, but like Elon, he said to me multiple times, he was like, this is such an old story. Like, why is anybody going to care about this? Max Levchin said to me directly, it was like, I just don't know why anybody's going to care about this. And I kind of knew. I was like, I don't think you know how much people can care about this. Like, I don't, that there's entire generations of entrepreneurs that I think look up to them now. But the problem is they're only in their like late 40s and early 50s. So they don't see themselves as like, Obi-Wan Kenobi. They're still Luke Skywalker, right? They're still like fighting the Death Star, right? And so that's the tough part is if Silicon Valley is always forward and future focused. And so I had to sort of like bring these people back to the past a bit. It was a fun exercise to do it.
I think when, for people you mentioned 15 to 25, I would also say 30, 40, it's really fantastic to read these stories. Also, you mentioned Sebastian Mallaby, for example, reading the stories also in his book from the 80s, 90s, how venture capital evolved, what the challenges were, why venture capital is venture capital as we know it today, is of tremendous value. Also, these background stories to see that people struggle. They are humans. They are not just machines being born with a natural gifted talent to work 24/7 and don't care about what's going on in life. They also experience a normal life. I think it's very helpful for the young generation.
I think it's helpful for everybody, by the way. Like plenty of the interesting thing about the story of Silicon Valley is it's told as a story of young people, but it's really not. Like a lot of the people that make big contributions to PayPal came with 20 years experience, not everybody, but a lot of them. I think that the key, what I hope people take from it is an appreciation for kind of like, what does the actual day-to-day of this kind of entrepreneurship look like and feel like? How do these people think about the world? And and then how much fun it is, like how much comedy there is, like in the middle of this whole crazy system. I think it's one of the things that surprised me most is that like actually these people have a very lively sense of humor, because these are ridiculous situations sometimes to be in.
Yeah, that's true. Jimmy, it is really great talking to you, and I think we could go on another 5 hours or 6 hours. Let me ask you two final questions. I think one just popped up in my mind when you mentioned the second point. Social skills. You mentioned that very often in your book. Negotiation skills make a difference. Social skills make a difference. What is your view on social skills in entrepreneurship? How important is it?
Oh, it's a good question. No one's asked me that before. I would say it depends very much on the role. If you are the head of business development or if you are the CEO, social skills matter to a degree, right? Like you have to be able to interface with people, connect with partners, tell people your story. But if you, in a funny way, at this moment in his life, so today you see sort of Max Levchin is Max Levchin. He can fly around the world. He can go to Sun Valley. He can go to Finland and be he was just in Finland on a panel. He's become very good at those things. He can go on CNBC and tell his story, and he is polished. At that moment in his life, he's not polished, and I think he'd be the first to say like he had certain social skills, but not others. So I think, and he was the CTO of the company. He didn't need to do those things, right? There were other people around who did that sort of work. So I think it very much depends on the role, because there's a way in which, like, part of what someone told me is the startup. One of the things that makes particularly startup founders successful is being able to tell the story of what the company could be publicly, right? So like projecting an image of the future. This is what Steve Jobs did exceptionally well, right? But I don't think that social skills are actually like all that required. In fact, I would argue Silicon Valley is one of the only places, technology now. Let's not just say Silicon Valley, but let's say the world of technology. It's one of the few places where somebody who has no social skills can actually do really, really well, right? Because code, you don't need to be nice to code. Code just needs to work. And so it is actually one of the few areas where you can be very introverted, maybe a little nerdy, and you can thrive.
Yeah, the nerds of yesterday are the heroes of today. This is quite interesting to see. You mentioned storytelling. You mentioned in your book, Elon Musk was a gifted storyteller already back in the 90s. I think there was one part in the book where you pointed at his storytelling skills. Is this?
Yes.
What makes storytelling so exceptionally important?
Oh, I mean, we could talk for 3 hours about this, but here's what I would say. So a startup is baked in uncertainty. It's uncertain from the beginning. So you have to persuade people to part with their money if they're investors, their time if they are employees, right? Or like smaller amounts of money if they are customers. And you're painting a vision of the future, right? You are actually telling a story of what will happen eventually, right? It's not like you can say like, hey, we have this thing. Here's, you can do that once the company's made. But at the beginning of a startup, you are trying to frame a narrative about what something might be or how something might work, right? And even when the product is done, you still have to convince people this is a vision of the future that you really want to be a part of. When you are recruiting somebody, you have to tell them, you're not going to say, I'm going to make emailing money really cool. You're going to say, we're going to change finance forever, right? And I think that's a place where, and I'm not the first person to say this, other people have identified it, but Elon has some real gifts as a storyteller and real gifts with language, I would say. He uses language in really interesting ways. He's very widely read. He drops literary and biblical and historical metaphors into the things that he says, but he is very, very good at framing a narrative of what the future can be, and then kind of like, fighting like hell to get there. And I think that is an underrated quality. Like that sort of storytelling is not easy to do. And you have to do it well if you're going to convince partners, if you're going to convince investors, potential employees. And it's a big part of what, multiple people identify. They said, you would interview with him and you would be sort of convinced that you were going to like take on JP Morgan and win. And even, by the way, even like sort of his peer group, like Max Levchin and others have said, like, he is one of these rare people where like he can convince you that he is doing God's work, like the most important work there is.
Okay. I don't know. I think, was it in your book or in Sebastian's book? Premature truth is something about storytelling. And I think it's also important not to take it too far, because sometimes people can stumble over storytelling as well.
Yeah. And look, there's a fine line between sort of storytelling and, straight up like lying. But I think people forget that startups are stories. Like it's actually like a story of something, it's sort of the classic hero's journey trope, right? But I think it's actually, it is a talent to be able to sketch a vision of the future and then convince people to build it. Like that's not easy. That is like, it really is actually the kind of thing, like we don't think about how hard some of this stuff is. But to sketch a portrait of something that might be, especially in the face of criticism, I think of that as something to be celebrated.
Yeah, especially it's mostly like people don't understand or are fighting against news stories sometimes at the beginning. Initially, it's very hard to move forwards then. And
that's right.
I think it's a very good point that you said, sketching a vision of the future. Let's use the final minutes in our recording to sketch a vision of your future. What's your future looking like in your mind when you think about your next project? What is your next project going to be?
Yeah, I have a somewhat unsatisfying answer, which is I don't know yet, but I'll give some clues into how I'm thinking about it. So I have this Google Doc I keep, which is literally the Google Doc. It's like books, like book ideas master doc or something. And what I do is I just sort of think about like books I want to buy that aren't written, or I think about sort of stories that are a little undercooked, right? That somebody should go back and really do a more rigorous job. And so I have this long list of just ideas I keep. It's mostly like a sanity thing. Like I toss them in there so I don't have to think about them. And then I kind of gather momentum, or I go meet with people, or I read more and I see what's there. And so I haven't settled on what's next for me yet, because my books are also, like, as you could probably tell, like they're not fast. It's not like it takes me like 1 year and then I'm done and I'm like on a track. It's more research and interviewing. And so I have to be really careful with the things I choose, because I sign up for them for like 3 or 4 years, 5, 6, whatever. I'm like on the hunt for a good sports story. Like I spent some time recently with an NBA team that's got a great story. Mm-hmm. And I'm like trying to think about like sports, because I think sports is just, I'm fascinated by it. I'm not a big sports watcher, but I sort of think of sports and the metaphors and like the discipline and the endurance. It's very much like a startup, And so I've been thinking about sports stories, but I'm also like, I want to find something that I really feel like, okay, this is something, like this could really be something. The Founders has done well and people really like it and people like the characters in it. But you don't get that all the time. You sort of have to find the right project and then go crazy. And so I'm still in that search for the right project. There's some things happening in space travel that I really think are cool. I spent 6 months talking to an astronaut while he was in space. So he and I would communicate every Sunday. We would have like a call, sort of like this, like an hour-long call for 6 months. So I have these 24 conversations from space that might become something, and things like that. So I'm sort of looking for an angle into a story that like somebody, part of what I try to do is I try to tell the story, or try to tell a story that somebody else isn't going to do. I'm actually sort of looking for like something a little like different. And so that's kind of where I'm at the moment. It's still searching for that different thing. So I welcome, like, if people have ideas, feel free to send them my way.
24 conversations from space sounds like a title. So.
Yeah.
Jimmy, is there anything at the end of the podcast you would like to talk about? Any question that I didn't ask and I should have asked?
No, look, I think you covered it, and covered areas that almost everybody misses. So you're clearly a careful reader.
Thanks.
But I just appreciate the time, and I appreciate you sharing this book with your audience. And and if anybody cracks the code, shoot me a DM. I'll send you a copy.
I will make that big. So a few clips and promote it in my network. Jimmy, Perfect. Thank you very much for your time and for writing this book. It's fantastic. I love it. I'm lucky. I still have halfway. So I still have a few pages to go, and I will definitely finish it. I wish you good luck for your future. Good luck with your family, all the health, success, and I hope to hear soon about your next book idea.
Well, thank you, Christian. I really appreciate all of that.
Have a great weekend. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.
Did you like this episode? Then please, wherever you listen or watch this video or podcast episode, please subscribe to the channel. It helps with the growth, and the more subscribers the podcast and the YouTube channel gets, the more attractive it becomes for speakers. So if you want to see more conversations, more interviews, please smash the like button or the subscribe button or both. Have a great day.